Hello, everyone. This is the 210th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview author Mr. Tony Kokkinos as we revisit and discuss his book, Caviar and Sausages, Arsenal in the Time of Wenger. This was published in 2021. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
I'm from North London, from a big family of Arsenal fans. My granddad, my parents, my dad used to take me to Highbury initially, so I've always followed Arsenal. I sort of always played sort of amateur football, so big fan. And then a few years ago, sort of towards the end of the Wenger reign, I was sort of getting a bit. I was reading a lot of blogs. It was a very divisive sort of Wenger out brigade versus Arsenal knows best sort of, and I was getting a bit fed up and prefer a bit more balanced debate. So I started to have the idea and about writing the a book about the Arsene Wenger time, not really an autobiography, but Arsenal during those years because it's such an iconic era. There was a lot of books about Wenger or books about like specific years, like the Invincibles, but there wasn't really one about the whole covering everything. So they published this, as you say, like 3 years ago.
So, to begin, can you explain the title of your book?
Quite early on in the Wenger era, obviously Arsene Wenger was like very good with quotes and always had some good quips. And quite early and after Arsenal already won a double, and then the next season there was a game they drew a couple of games, and the crowd were a bit like typical fans, a bit restless. And he got asked about it, and he said, "If you eat caviar every day, it's difficult to return to sausages." So I thought it's one of his famous quotes, and I thought it was a good way of sort of showing that I was going to talk about the good and the bad, although caviar and sausages, some people will say, are both good. So I thought it was quite a good way.
The theme of your book, you present it as three different stages of the Arsene Wenger era at Arsenal.
A lot of people, when they talk about the Wenger era, 22 years, they break it up into up to 2005, six, sort of, the trophies, Invincibles, the success, and then like the rest presented as failure. So I always thought that really there was three stages. So yeah, 96 to 2005, where winning three league titles, FA Cups, Invincibles, two doubles. I think that's sort of pretty clear. And then the rest of his era, I broke into two because I think so. I've got 2005 to 2013, which is Arsenal moving to the new stadium. They were really just trying to run on a zero net budget, and in fact, actually, during that time, he managed to have 30 million transfer net income, which is pretty impressive, and still keep them sort of doing all right. But we'll talk about whether that's he was doing well or not then. And yeah, there was like the financial fair play, obviously the new stadium they were paying off. So it was very hard to compete. And then the third stage for me is 2013 to the end till he left 2018 with marked by the signing of Ozil from Real Madrid. No one Arsenal never bought a player from Madrid before, like a big club. It was 40 odd million. And then they did spend a lot of money, but Sanchez, some other buys that weren't so good, and they obviously they weren't as good buys. It wasn't as successful. So yeah, I feel like the middle stage there's some sort of mitigation. The third stage he was backed, and sort of lost his touch a bit.
Let's go back in time. Can you present the status of Arsenal in the English football landscape in the summer of 1996, following the brief tenure of Bruce Rioch that had followed the long tenure of George Graham?
So this is, the pretty early stages in the Premier League, which is obviously a big sort of revolution in football. Premier League's only about 5 years old. There's all the new money in it from Sky Sports. loads of live games and hype. Man United were the dominant team. George Graham sort of was very successful manager. He challenged like Liverpool with a dominant team, sort of 80s. George Graham came in with a young team, challenged them, won two league titles, obviously the famous Anfield 89. But then he sort of lost his way a bit. Arsenal became a bit the sort of boring Arsenal 1-0 to the Arsenal. It was they had the strong defence and they were just trying to hit like a target man and hope Ian Wright sort of got on the end of something. But then he lost his job through, he took a bung, took a sort of private payment from Arsenal, made bought two Norwegian players, and he got personally about 400 grand from that. It was found. So yeah, pretty really sad for Arsenal fans like myself that grew up with the George Graham era and really liked him. I would say that it doesn't really make it right, but taking those bungs in those days was quite common. And George Graham, I think he's quite bitter about it. He was the only big name that actually got sort of done for it. But yeah, then Arsenal hired Bruce Rioch and just one season. And he did sort of turn things around. He signed Dennis Bergkamp and David Platt, which is obviously Bergkamp from Milan, world-class player, was like a massive deal for Arsenal. Had a decent season. They came fifth, but he didn't get on with the players, especially like Ian Wright didn't want to play for him, was going to leave, and very intensive sort of military training style. So he was sacked 5 days before the start of the season. So, Arsenal were not in good shape. Paul Merson, one of the great sort of academy players, had admitted to a coke and gambling problem. And then a bit later, just after Arsene Wenger joined, Tony Adams announced that he was an alcoholic, club captain. So, yeah, Arsenal was in a bit of a mess.
What was the reaction when Arsenal hired Arsene Wenger as manager? There's that famous Arsene Who headline and all that.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of rumours that Arsenal were going to get Johan Cruyff, which obviously everyone was like, well, it'd be amazing, legend of the game. Or Terry Venables, who was very respected, like tactical, been at Barcelona, even though he'd been a Tottenham manager, tactical sort of manager, exciting. And then when sort of it came that it was going to be Arsene Wenger, everyone was like, no one heard of it. It wasn't a global game then. No one had really heard of him, even though he had managed Monaco, got to, I think, the Champions League semi-finals, but he was in Japan then at Grand Passé. So yeah, and there was a lot of xenophobia in British football then, and the media, and probably just generally. Most of the managers, well, pretty much all the managers were British ex-players. I think there was just Ruud Gullit at Chelsea. And so, yeah, there was a lot of skepticism amongst the media, the fans, and the players, it turns out. They were like, who is he? And I don't think it helped that his look, he wore glasses, he looked a bit nerdy, and football fans are a bit sort of ruthless and that sort of judgmental. And yes, I don't think that helped. So everyone was like, what are we doing? Yeah.
So how quickly did Wenger change the perception of the Arsenal fans?
Because he was still contracted in Grand Passé, he didn't come straight away. It was a sort of month or two gap where he's ending his contract. But he sort of scouted or said to Arsenal, sign these two French players, Patrick Vieira and Remy Gard. And then there was Sheffield Wednesday game. So before Wenger's even there, and I think Vieira was on the bench, just started. He's really young. Ray Parlour got injured after 20 minutes. So Vieira came on. And it was just like a revolution watching him. Arsenal used to these stodgy midfielders, and then Vieira came on, 6'4", striding through the midfield, physical, but amazing talent, like glide, can run with the ball, and straight away, as soon as he gets it, looking for that forward pass usually to Ian Wright. And I think that was like a real marker that Arsenal fans and the media are like, wow, who's this? He's going to sign these players we'd never heard of that were like levels above what we've seen. So that was a big deal. And then when he did join, he's obviously very intelligent, speaks well, and he did start to come across more interviews, comes across very well. And then that football early on was really good. Arsenal had been used to, we're saying like, quite boring football, but we started to play some good football. So there was Bergkamp, Wright, Merson, Vieira, Platt, as well as that sort of the old school defence. So pretty quickly in that first season, people were like, okay, I think we might be onto something. Sort of the mood was turned around quite quick.
In a way, did Wenger come at the right time in England, as this was the first season where the Boseman ruling took effect and player and manager transfers were easier?
Yeah, I think at that time was the start of the globalization of the game, where players did start to move countries and move around a lot easier. You know, it used to be a big thing if sort of when a player moved to a different country, or especially in Britain if a British player moved abroad. But yeah, most players in the Premier League were British, so yeah, he definitely took advantage of that whole globalization. Actually, that sort of hindered him later down the line as he had to sort of sell players as they run their contracts down. But he really was a trailblazer in this area. He had the sort of encyclopedia knowledge of the French, young French players. And obviously, it was a great era for French talent. They won the World Cup a couple of years later. And also African players and also some others, you know, like Overmars sort of was a known name, but he'd had a knee injury and he took a risk on his sort of fitness. Almost all the players he signed in those early days had a real immediate impact and sort of raised the level.
And you already mentioned Vieira. Wenger's initial transfers did include many French players as well as from other nations. Some were confirmed stars, some were unknown, promising young players. So there was that balance. And yeah, his knowledge of European football was very important in spotting these required players who would become stars down the road.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, maybe like in France, I guess people knew in France these were like sort of very talented players like Anelka, but yeah, I mean, to get that sort of French core of players he bought early on, Anelka, Vieira, Petit, and then, as I say, Remy Gard. The Wenger interviews, you know, he used to say like he really was a football person that sort of would watch any random game like in his spare time. So, and he'd identify players that looked good. But I mean, he did have a great eye for talent because Vieira was sort of struggling at AC Milan. Anelka was known, who was only 17, was known as a talent. But like Petit was playing in defence and Wenger moved him to centre midfield. So, you know, it was one of his others. So he had a great eye for talent and sort of bit thinking out the box. Obviously, you know, later on, he also moved Henry from a winger to forward. You know, Van Persie, similar midfielders to fullbacks. So, yeah, he had a great knowledge of the global players, but also a real good eye for like talented players and how he could use them.
How important was the presence of the famous back four in providing an experienced nucleus and base?
They were very important. I guess Wenger got lucky that he had that.
For anyone who might not know, we're talking about the Arsenal defense, the goalkeeper David Seaman, of course, the defensive line of the captain Tony Adams and the likes of Martin Keown, Lee Dixon, and Nigel Winterburn on the wings as outside backs. Sometimes Steve Bull also as part of this famous back four or back five, if we should say.
Oh, it's probably there the original, and Keown came in. Yeah, yeah, very important. I mean, they were there during Arsenal's sort of the George Graham success. So when Wenger came, they were all pretty much in their 30s, but they were so good at playing together. George Graham drilled them, had got them amazingly organised, famous for playing the offside trap, and it really was historically they were like famous. Arsenal went 1-0 up, and everyone was like, "That's it, game over," because they were so good at defending. But yeah, they were pretty old. But he was lucky to have them, but he was also showed his flexibility and intelligence to, I think, recognise them, and he developed their games. He sort of rejuvenated them because now he was like, I want you to start playing out the back and play football, which so they gave them a new lease of life because before they were very much defend, get the ball forward, give the ball to someone else. But now they showed that they also were good on the ball. So yeah, combining those with the more attacking mid and players and midfielders he bought, it was almost like a sort of perfect storm.
Wenger also changed many poor habits, mostly off the field, that was symptomatic of English football in general. At the time, this was looked upon as being revolutionary. Was this change in mentality paramount in turning the club around, leading to the first double in 1998?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, it's a bit strange now to think that professional athletes were sort of drinking 15 pints of beer on a Tuesday and, eating sort of terrible food and stuff. But it's pretty obvious to sort of change that. But yeah, he was the one that did bring in the new diets. Sort of famously like more rice and chicken and vegetables, broccoli, and cutting out a lot of the junk food, the sort of Tuesday drinking club. I guess, I mentioned Tony Adams and Merson's problems, that sort of died. But yeah, he brought in a lot more stretching. Training was lots of small sided games. So the ball was always involved. So for Arsenal players that had been at George Graham and then under George Graham, then Bruce Rioch, where it was sort of very old school, a lot about being organised, he gave them that sort of freedom and obviously personal skills, very high level. He's got the good humour, so he won them over in that respect and gave the players a sort of freedom to express themselves. So I think quickly the players really bought into the new methods. And talking about the famous back four, I mean, especially they were beneficiaries because, as I say, most managers coming at that time would have got rid of those, most of them pretty quickly. But
Yeah,
he,
well, we can say he prolonged their careers
oh,
with his new
totally.
methods. Yeah.
Yeah. Those Tony Adams sort of won a captain the league title in 3 decades, So really extended careers and showed a good side, a new side of them, their football, yeah.
Yeah, and when Wenger won the double in 98, he was the first ever foreign and non-British manager to win the English title. Right from the start, from the first season, 1996-97 season, he had run-ins with Manchester United manager Sir Alex Ferguson. And this rivalry would be the hallmark of the Premier League of this era, as they were the two greatest sides of this era. You think did each side push the other to excel?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I've got a big section, sort of its own section in the book on the Man United Arsenal rivalry, which are called Battle Royale. There's a lot of hype around sort of these games, and Sky, used to hype up. But this is one time these games sort of did live up to the hype. They were all, I mean, Man United were the dominant team. Alex Ferguson's the dominant figure in British football at the time. He had a lot of power. Arsene Wenger was really the first person that stood up to him. Ferguson, sort of, the media were quite scared of him. The refs were scared of him. Obviously, some of his players were, but he had a great side, and they were dominant. And Arsene Wenger really came in, and both on the pitch and off the pitch, he sort of stood up to him and ruffled their feathers. But the rivalry, definitely, they pushed each other. It was the quality in both teams was amazing. There was individual rivalries on the pitch. The captains Vieira, Keane in midfield. You got Van Nistelrooy and Keown, Overmars and Neville on the wing. Cole later on, a bit like Ashley Cole and Ronaldo. Wright and Schmeichel used to clash. For 9 years, Arsenal and Man United were the only teams that won the league, and they both were also winning FA Cups. It was amazing. The football was brilliant. All of those games when they played each other were sort of real pulsating, high level, and there was a lot of incidents, fights on the pitch, fights in the dressing room, memorable goals and games, and they really sort of did. The managers at the time really hated each other. The players did. When you hear them interview, they hated each other, and the fans obviously did. That was the big rivalry. So, and to win the league, you had to beat Man United, and usually you had to beat them at Old Trafford. 2 or 3 times Arsenal managed to do that.
And the first conflict in that first season was around the tail end of the season where Manchester United were involved in the Champions League. And I guess they had wanted to rearrange matches, and that would have extended the season. And Arsene Wenger was opposed to this because it seemed to be, I guess, advantageous to Manchester United. And Ferguson attacked him by saying something like, Wenger has been in Japan. He doesn't know anything about English football and the demands of our game, or comments like that. So that was kind of like the beginning of at least the verbal rivalry. And later on, we have the whole pizza fight, among other things. So there were a lot of and of course, the clashes on the field. So there was a lot of back and forth between the two. Like I said, they were the dominant sides, and that's how they had to compete not only on the field but also in mind games, so to speak.
Just like a good example, Fergie was famous for that mind games and using the media and really putting pressure on the other teams and managers. And it was only a year or two before that he sort of wound Kevin Keegan up. Newcastle were flying,
Right.
and sort of Keegan really lost it in a famous media interview. And yeah, I mean, I guess the players do look at what the managers are saying and how they're reacting. And so to see Wenger sort of come back with clever, funny, or strong words back, I think it did make a difference. He didn't sort of back down. Yeah.
Of course, in this last decade, it's mostly been Liverpool and Guardiola's Manchester City. That's been the main rivalry. How would you compare and contrast these two rivalries at different eras of the Premier League?
There was some, I think Jamie Carragher recently, last year, was like trying to say the Liverpool Man City was the best rivalry. And I mean, no way. The Arsenal Man United, they won all the leagues in 9 years. It was split something like, well, when Wenger came in, maybe 5 or 6-3, which was pretty good considering Man United the best, had a lot more
Yeah, I
money.
mean, they were the main rivals to Manchester United. It's fair to say, if not for Arsenal, Manchester United would be winning titles like, like Bayern Munich was been doing like for like 10, 11 years in a row, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, but Liverpool only won one title was against six for Man City or something. So until like last year. So yeah, it didn't have that edge that it used to. I think the players, there wasn't the sort of real bitterness against each other. It was a lot of good. The Man City Liverpool I'm talking about. Sorry, the games were good, but I mean, there wasn't the sort of bitterness and famous sort of real famous games and incidents that you can go back to that are memorable. So yeah, I think it's always going to be the big Premier League rivalry.
So the football, I mean, stylistically and tactically in the Premier League, I mean, how would you compare it then to, let's say, this era? I mean, it's a very hard question, but still.
It's interesting, and I think if you look at games from that era, not just Arsenal, like any games from that era, that it's much faster, more chaotic, less structured, less possession based. Now all the teams are sort of playing the Guardiola, let's keep the possession, pass it out from the goalkeeper. I think it was more physical and less technical. Definitely the technical quality now of all the players, all the even the teams down the bottom, they're all technically a lot better. They probably are a lot fitter, but the game now seems to be a bit slower. So then if you watch some highlights from back then, it's really fast, end to end, a lot happening. The pitches weren't so good, so maybe that's why they partly like get the ball forward a bit more. They're not passing it around their penalty area, and the referees obviously you can sort of pile into tackles a lot more. Then there was a lot of sliding tackles and sort of some ones that wouldn't be allowed now. And I think, and also there wasn't. I don't know. I don't want to be like rose tinted glasses, but I do feel there was less of the tactical fouling what we see now, and less real cynical time wasting. What I see now is, and I think I don't know if it was Guardiola that started it. Man City originally were the experts, but anytime someone sort of did a counter attack, well, does a counter attack now, someone takes them down, and then the game resets, free kick, they take the yellow, and then the next time it's another player does it. I don't know. I mean, there was a lot of fouls back then, but I don't think it was as clever, sort of tactical fouling. So it did feel like you could sit flow a bit more. But maybe I'm being a bit romantic.
In 1999, Arsene Wenger signed Thierry Henry. What was the Arsenal team style after Henry was signed? And also, we have the back four gradually, they're either retiring or transferring out. So, what was it like to be an Arsenal fan during this time?
It was just a whole new era. That the thing was, so Overmars, Petit, Anelka all wanted to go. Went to Barcelona, Real Madrid. Great players, but Arsene Wenger had this sort of ability. Just but no, sell them for good price. But no worries, I'll sell Anelka, I'll get Henri. Sell Overmars, we'll get Pires. So he just sort of seamlessly could replace players, and the team was just still playing this sort of very fast. And Arsenal always then had like these tall, physical players, but also very technical, a lot of pace. The Arsenal would transition very quickly, and obviously Henri was at the forefront of that. I mean, the best player in the world at the time, or one of them. And after his initial sort of first month or two, people were a bit worried. But once he's settled in, just amazing. The dribbler, technically great, assists, goals, strikes the ball left foot, right foot. So as an Arsenal fan, it was just amazing that we hadn't seen football like that ever before. And I think after losing 99 was sort of devastating for Arsenal because it was Arsenal, Man United all the way. And then Man United won the FA Cup semi-final replay, the famous Ryan Giggs goal. Dennis Bergkamp missed a penalty. Then Man United went on to win the league, won the Champions League. So that was real devastating because Arsenal very easily could have done the double that year and ended up with nothing and watching Man United win the treble. But then that was really Arsenal building his second team. So yeah, as you say, had to replace the famous back four. And he did build a whole team from scratch. Ashley Cole, Lauren at right back, converted midfielder. Colo Torre, signed for a few 100,000, no one had ever heard of. Sol Campbell, Jens Lehmann, and then players like Gilberto and Edu. So again, yeah, really just master at recruitment. I think that was Arsenal's best team between 2002 and 2004.
In this era, Arsenal wins the double again because there have been so many doubles in the recent decades that we sometimes lose sight of just how difficult winning a double was. I think up until Manchester United won the double in 94 and 96, I think there had only been like three teams in the 20th century that had won the double. And of course, Arsenal was one of them in 1971. But yeah, Wenger won two doubles in few seasons. And of course, there's the Invincibles, the 2003 2004 season, which was the pinnacle of this team. And by now, Patrick Vieira was the captain as Tony Adams retired after the 2002 title.
Yeah, as I say, we've not seen football like that. Arsenal would blow away teams often, like in first 20 minutes, just be like bang, bang, game over. They'd be like 3-0 up. such fast sort of interplay. I mean, that had world-class players really, like obviously Bergkamp, Omri, Vieira, Ashley Cole, could put Sol Campbell in there. So, I mean, that had sort of world-class players throughout the team. And even there was games where other fans clapped them off, which, with football rivalry as it is, was amazing. But some other fans, I remember there was Portsmouth, they just were so impressed with the game, how Arsenal played, that they clapped them off at the end. It was amazing.
Did this Arsenal team, did this generation underachieve by not winning the Champions League?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, they were one of the best teams in Europe, but I guess you can't really say it if you don't win it. They definitely should have done. There was a lot of near misses. A bit strange they didn't do better in some ways, but it's always like something happened, and it was a bit harder then for I think English teams because, as you say, like they're still competing. The FA Cup's taken seriously, so you get to that point around February, March where you got league games, you got two league games in 3 days, you've got an FA Cup quarter-final, semi-final, Champions League quarter-final, and the squads weren't as big. But definitely Arsenal should have done for the legacy of that team. They should have won at least one Champions League. 2004 was the big miss. Chelsea in the quarter-final, it was 1-1 after the first leg. And Arsenal in those days, they hadn't lost to Chelsea in about like 18 games or something. And it was just when Chelsea was starting to come up, but Arsenal always had their mark. And everyone just assumed Arsenal would win at home. And in the end, that was the semi final was like Monaco. And I think that was the year Porto, Jose Mourinho won. So yeah, that was really there for the taking. There was another couple of years where they lost I think they lost once on Valencia on away goals. Yeah, that was a big miss. So Arsene Wenger not winning the Champions League or even a European trophy is sort of something missing for sure.
We reach the phase two. Now, we have the arrival of Roman Abramovich at Chelsea, and a few years after that, there's the nation state funded Manchester City. And this tipped the balance of power in the Premier League. We also have to remember that Arsenal had funded the Emirates Stadium. This was to be opened in 2007, and the transfer budget would be limited in this phase. So, reaching the 2006 Champions League final that they lost to Barcelona, that was in a way a reference point in the end of a cycle. Were these two simultaneous events, not to mention we also have the resignation of Arsenal Vice President David Dean in 2007, the end of the Arsenal challenge?
Yeah, as you say, definitely a whole new era. We've got Vieira left, 2005. And also that first year after 2006, I mean, but they weren't really challenging in the league then, but they did have the great run to get to the Champions League final. And it was a whole new group of players. Fabregas, Kleb, Ibue, Flamini, Zenros, Young. So because of what you're saying, the stadium there was a clear policy that Arsenal had to sort of be run a balance the books, and Wenger really was like scouting to try and get young talent cheap, and he did sign a lot of great young players, but as I say, competing with Chelsea, who were just buying whoever they wanted, really strong teams. Yeah, it was just a real struggle for Arsenal, to compete over a whole season. They could go for a while, 2007, 8, led the league, maybe two-thirds of the season. But once it got tougher, they just, injuries, they just didn't have enough. So, yeah, the new stadium really sort of held them back. And as I said earlier, like Arsene Wenger actually, used to sell the sort of best players in the end. And actually, they made like 30 million net income on transfer over that sort of 8 or 9 years. And also, Arsenal did trust the financial fair play rules. They were quite naive, and sort of were like, okay, we'll do things right. Everyone else will be brought into line and will be an even playing field. And obviously, we've seen that clubs always find ways around these rules. And you mentioned David Dean, who was the main sort of instigator in signing Wenger in the first place. They had a very close relationship, and Dean was sort of he was the vice chairman, but probably now he'd be like director of football or similar title. But yeah, he really pushed Wenger. I think he was a bit more of a risk taker. There were some signings that Wenger famously was like, I nearly signed Messi, I nearly signed Ronaldo, I nearly signed, a whole list. Basically, any great player in that era, Arsene Wenger nearly signed. So, but I think David Dean would have pushed Arsenal to be a bit more aggressive, get those one or two extra players or quality player, and also take the load off because it seemed like he wasn't really replaced. I mean, got Gazidis later, but yeah. So that was a bit of a perfect sort of negative storm around that time for Arsenal.
Why did the Invincibles break up so quickly?
Yeah, this was always a bit of shame. I remember when, I mean, Arsenal 2002 to 4, they won two leagues. They should have won the league in the middle, won two FA Cups. They won four of the six trophies, domestic trophies. And the Invincibles obviously is a famous year. And at the time, everyone was like, this is a power shift. This team's going to dominate for years to come. And yeah, I mean, in the book, I call it breaking up the band. I don't think it was a deliberate policy. There's some players, some of the squad players maybe were just at the end, sort of coming to the end or getting more injuries, like Keown, or a bit older, like Parler, Kanu. So a few of those left got injured. Lauren got a long-term injury and never really was the same again. Obviously, they sold Vieira, the talisman, the captain, which was maybe like if they didn't have to raise money, they would have kept Vieira and Fabregas. But at the time, it was like, well, I've got Fabregas, and we can take the money for Vieira. So yeah, it was all sort of a combination of things, but it was far too quick to break up such a great team and like to win the league without losing a game, and then the next season sort of not really be challenging for the title is just which is another of Arsene Wenger's sort of legacy misses. He never defended the title. And I think Alex Ferguson was always very good at like if he won a title, he'd build from a position of strength and they'd add players even though they were the better team. So he'd constantly sort of rejuvenate it.
How did Arsenal's style evolve in this phase two? And why wasn't it as effective? What were its strengths and weaknesses?
It was a lot less direct and vertical. And when I say direct, as in Arsenal in the previous year, obviously they weren't hitting like long, hopeful balls, but they were transitions were so fast. But the Arsenal in this sort of phase two became a lot more shorter, fast passing, positional interplay, more possession based. And they were just full of number 10s. Like Arsene Wenger accumulated sort of number 10s, Kleb, Rosicky, Nasri, Cesc, Wilshere, which and great players, but he seemed to pack the team out of them. And it was a bit like, obviously at this time we had Guardiola's tiki taka, and it was sort of a bit tiki taka light, like they were trying to emulate. But obviously we didn't have Messi. But all those players, they're maybe like 5'9", 5'10", whereas before Arsenal players were all like sort of giants. So they were less physical and there was less real outright express pace. So it was a bit slower. It was still often very effective, but defensively sort of failed to address the weak spots. I mean, Arsenal had Almunia as a goalkeeper for years and years. Set pieces defensively were a real weakness. I don't know if it was a conscious decision, but it seemed like you're just lacking a few sort of more physical players and maybe went a bit too far in one direction.
In this second phase, this post Emirates Stadium era, was Wenger essentially building a team with young players with potential who might one day become stars. You mentioned some of them. We can also name Theo Walcott, Abu Dhabi, Carlos Vela, Nicholas Bentner, and of course Fabregas. These are all being groomed to be the next superstars. But many of them were impatient to win titles, and you have the likes of Ashley Cole joining Chelsea, and later the likes of, I think, Bakary Sanya or Samir Nasri, that would join Manchester City because they were eager to win titles. So was Wenger's success essentially maintaining a competitive side that could qualify for the Champions League, but was clearly not good enough to win a title?
Yeah, I guess that's probably the most controversial, debated point about the Arsene Wenger era. Like some people would say, yes, the top four every year was a success. Others were like, we should have won more. Yeah, I think the things we've discussed with competing against Chelsea's money, Man U still have money, and then as you say, Man City, and was definitely with competing with them and sort of zero net spend. I mean, you have to give a lot of credit. I don't know many other managers that would have been able to do that over such a long time. If you look at it now, you've got teams, Newcastle or others, big clubs, they're celebrating coming fourth and getting in the Champions League. So I think there's definitely, Arsene Wenger deserves the credit for that. He's got the statue outside the stadium, kept Arsenal competitive in the Champions League. The disappointment, and obviously he had the quote at the time saying top four is a trophy because the media were always like, Arsenal haven't won a trophy for 7 years, 8 years, 9 years. And he said top four is a trophy, which really annoyed a lot of people. And he did neglect the cups during that time because of to focus on league games. And there was opportunities to win an FA Cup or a League Cup, which would have just sort of given the fans a bit of celebration and and then sort of avoided like the whole losers sort of tag. So yeah, I guess it's a bit I don't know the answer, but I guess he does deserve credit, but there was a couple of years where they could have pushed and they could have won, would have won things.
So now we come to the phase three. So after the Emirates Stadium related financial shackles were off, in an unprecedented manner, Arsenal has spent heavily in 2013 to sign, as you mentioned earlier, Mesut Ozil from Real Madrid, and a year later, Alexis Sanchez. But this was to very little effect. Was the truth that Arsenal required five or six players of similar quality in the same transfer window to have any hope of a title challenge?
I would say maybe it felt that Arsenal was three players away. They tend to have a small squad, and the backups, once all the games piled up towards the end of the season, the backups weren't the same quality. The scouting, obviously Ozil and Sanchez were the headline signings, but the scouting then, like Arsene Wenger had lost his touch. He wasn't signing Anelkas and Vieiras. Every club now had scouts in Europe and were getting these young players. And Arsenal was signing, making expensive sort of missteps. There was a transfer window where they signed Mustafi, Granit Xhaka, Lucas Perez for like 90 million. So, 90 million maybe 10 years ago, 8, 9, 10 years ago, is a huge amount of money. And so it really made some bad mistakes. They were very loyal to underperformers who were on good wages. I think there was some opportunities there, like obviously in that time Leicester won the Premier League title. So going back to what we said before, it was definitely doable to be winning a league in that era.
They did win the FA Cup. In fact, in this last phase, they won three FA Cups in 2014, 2015, and 2017. Was Wenger victim of the fact that the FA Cup did not have its allure of the past?
Yeah, the FA Cup wasn't like it used to be, but it was definitely very welcomed at the time, especially that first one, because as I say, like just to get that sort of trophy drought off the back. But in the league or the Champions League, Arsenal were drifting, and also the football wasn't as good.
Also, around this time, there's that remark by Roy Keane how he would describe these latter Arsenal crop players as just being interested in selfies, six pack, and their hair.
Yeah, well, I guess it's an easy to criticize if you're not doing well when there's those sort of things. I don't know if Arsenal had a sort of like glamour boy players, but definitely the mentality. They obviously didn't have that winning mentality that the previous players did. The Tony Adams, the Vieiras, Bergkamps. So I think it's a good quote, but there's probably some truth in it, yeah, in what he's saying.
I imagine when Pochettino's Tottenham started bypassing Arsenal in the last two seasons, that's when the most ardent Arsenal fans had enough. Was this the time when the Wenger out demands became more noticeable?
Around that time, like Arsenal fans were definitely were not used to losing to Tottenham. There was a long time where they didn't lose them at all for years. So yeah, that was probably Tottenham starting to do well was an indicator, but there was I think some others that were a bit more below. Like there was 8-2 loss at Old Trafford a bit years before. It was really really embarrassing. I think even Fergie was embarrassed by that. But then there was the sort of 3-5-1 losses against Bayern Munich. So as we're saying, like Arsenal was getting into the last 16 of the Champions League for a lot of clubs. That's a good achievement, but not what Arsenal, were really going for. And then as soon as they came up against Bayern Munich, were just getting hammered and hammered like it's embarrassing. And that was those sort of things and not challenging in the league, just sort of trying to scrape into the top four every season. Grew the sort of Wenger out crowd grew, and also the fact that fans didn't see how it was going to turn around because Arsene Wenger was very stubborn and he just often would start to make excuses like in those times, like say like we lost 5-1, but I think there was a 10, sending off in one of those, blame the ref, or he wouldn't give an indication that he was going to change to make it better. It was just like, no, next year we'll do the same, but it will work.
In hindsight, do you think he should have left the club on a high in 2006?
I think later, I don't know what other managers would have been able to sort of manage the whole like low budget move to the stadium and not being able to spend. So I think really after the whole FA Cup final, that first cup final he won would have been, and I think he would have gone in the semi final. I can't remember, was it Wigan? I think Arsenal were playing, but they would only won on penalties against like a championship team. And I think if Arsenal lost that, he might have gone then. But yeah, I think he should have gone after that first cup final and said, look, I've managed to transition to the stadium. We've won something now. We've got a core of good players and let someone else sort of build it up again. But I also blame the club. There was no one at the club. Arsene Wenger became sort of he could do what he wants. There was no one above him. sort of questioning, holding him to account, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to improve this? Do you need some help? Why are you not getting a new, changing the coach? Do you think people need a fresh voice?
Right. And
Yeah.
Mourinho also would point it out that Arsene Wenger's job was the only one that was safe in the Premier League.
Yeah, the board at the time, I mean, there was different owners, but the Cronkies were standoff owners, but the board was sort of the old school board, ultimate respect for Arsene Wenger. And yeah, I mean, in the end, obviously, he did sort of get asked to leave, but yeah, for years and years, he could do what he wants.
Do you know if he regretted not taking other jobs?
Yeah, I think he's done interviews where he talked about that, like with Real Madrid. I don't know, he sort of said he regrets it, but he always mentions he could have gone to Real Madrid, could have gone there and managed England, and a couple of others. But I think Man United talk at one point, maybe, I don't know, but probably rumours. But I would say to that was, as we just said, like he wouldn't be allowed to manage Real Madrid for years and years without winning stuff. And obviously, I'm sure he would with the players they've got, but I don't know how long he'd last at Real Madrid. And also, he'd get all interference in the transfers, the management style from sort of the board. So I don't think he would have enjoyed it or lasted long at many other clubs. And he didn't manage a club after he left Arsenal. I know he was a bit older, but I'm sure he would have got offers.
Is he, in a way, a cautionary tale for the success of having confidence and maintaining a manager in place, as well as the stagnation of staying too long in a job?
Yes, I think 22 years as a manager at a club at a high level, I can't see how that's going to happen again. We've seen the Premier League managers. I mean, I think Arteta's one of the longest serving in England now, and he's maybe 6 years. So, yeah, I definitely don't think that won't happen again. And the sort of learnings are you have to evolve. The game evolves, tactics evolve, other teams are changing. There's new managers and new stars, new players. Fergie, he did reinvent teams. And I think one of the big things he did, he brought in new coaches. He went through a few coaches and allowed them sort of a voice. So if you're a player, you're getting new, the training's a bit different. You're hearing new things. It keeps it fresh. Whereas Arsene Wenger always, was hands on, just had the same coach, Pat Rice, for years. So, yeah, I think as you say, it does stagnate. You have to change things up if you are going to stay that long.
Did Wenger's early quick success at Arsenal pave the way for the arrival of more foreign managers in the English Premier League?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as we said before, like it was only Hullet at Chelsea before. UK football was pretty xenophobic. It was very jobs for the boys. All the managers were just ex-British players. Maybe a lot of them have not been that successful. So yeah, since we've seen loads of different managers, obviously Mourinho, Guardiola are the sort of Klopp are the famous ones. But yeah, I mean the Premier League's never been won by an English manager. Champions League's not been won by an English manager since the 80s. And there hasn't been an English manager winning a trophy 2008. So yeah, definitely I think after the initial skepticism paved the way for people looking overseas.
Is it fair to say that the careers of the likes of Henri and Vieira, among others, are inextricably linked to Wenger? Even looking back at his Monaco career, he was responsible for launching into spotlight, the likes of George Weah, Yuri Zhorkaev, Lilian Thuram, and of course Anelka, Fabregas, and all the other names. When Glenn Hoddle, when he was at Monaco, he even said that Wenger had opened his eyes. Does his influence trickle over so many players and generations?
Yeah, I mean, definitely just the names you've mentioned there, a real range of sort of legendary players. And yeah, I mean, almost exclusively Arsene Wenger's ex-players speak highly of him. I can't really think of anyone that doesn't have ultimate respect for him and loved playing for him, loved his loyalty and sort of how you let them play. And yeah, it's interesting now that you've got a lot of his ex-players managers, and you know, Omri was sort of manager, and I think he's still coaching the under 21s in France, but Vieira, and one that really keep an eye on is Fabregas. You know, he's managing at Como. I think he got promoted last year, and yeah, I expect he'll, if he carries on doing well, he's going to get a big managerial job. And they all sort of, I guess Fabregas is an interesting one because he played under Mourinho and Pep and Wenger. So I guess he's probably got the most broadest range. And if he picks the best from each, then he's going to do well.
Did Wenger also have the knack to sell players at the right time, as some of them did not have the same impact afterwards, like we mentioned Henri and Vieira?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be a thing at Arsenal that players never did well after, and no one wanted to see Overmars or Petit or Anelka go because they were great players. But yeah, it was like, well, Arsenal, they never do well. But that did change, that players did start to do well after. But I think the big thing, like we mentioned earlier, was that Wenger just had that knack and the scouting and the eye that he could just replace them. As I said, I think before, like Anelka goes, signs Omri, Overmars goes, get Pires, Vieira, we have Fabregas, although, you know, there's a bit of overlap. So, yeah, I think what he really lost was that scouting, that eye, and it became so competitive. Like every team is scouting all over Africa, Europe, South America, and picking up this talent.
In closing, what is the historical legacy of Arsene Wenger in not only the history of Arsenal, but that of English football as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, huge. So it changed English football. The was very sort of big part in the style of play changing, becoming a lot more attacking, sort of technical football. The players' methods we discussed, the sort of the training, the diet, making it more professional, and part of that whole when English football became really global for Arsenal is huge. You know, just if you look at the obviously what the success, the Invincibles, the doubles, the cups, the fans, like the rocking stadiums with amazing football, sort of Arsenal's best ever teams, players, and a huge thing is he gave Arsenal fans all around the world because Arsenal used to big in different areas, Scandinavia, but especially a lot of fans now in France and Africa, and that's due to Arsenal's Arsene Wenger and the players he brought in the game. The most successful period since the 30s for Arsenal. There's then add to that the new stadium. He has a lot of new era that he was sort of a big part in. I wouldn't. Some Arsenal fans say he built the stadium. I wouldn't go that far. And he changed the Arsenal's reputation from sort of boring Arsenal to Arsenal fans of the sort of Wenger generation on expect Arsenal to play good attacking football. Whereas when I was growing up, it was not sort of what we used to seeing. So it's now an expectation. So yeah, just actually huge legacy for the club and English game.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the links to Mr. Kokkinos' book are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Tony, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Right. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.